Hey guys, tonight we're pulling up a very precarious chair at the royal banquet table, not to indulge in a sumptuous feast, oh no. We're here to explore one of history's most nerve-wracking and frankly least appetizing professions, that of the royal food taster. Imagine being surrounded by glittering gold plate, the finest silks, and the murmur of powerful courtiers, only to feel a cold dread with every dish presented. It sounds glamorous, perhaps a bit like being a medieval food critic with life or death stakes. But as we'll discover, it was mostly just a gilded cage with a very real, very frequently suspected, poisoned chalice. Frankly, with the political intrigue and the rudimentary understanding of toxicology, you probably wouldn't survive your first week on the job without developing a serious complex about parsley. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your location and local time in the comments below. It's always fascinating to see where everyone's drifting off from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You picture it, don't you? The grandeur of a royal court, perhaps King Arthur's Camelot, if he were real and particularly paranoid, or the opulent halls of a Renaissance Italian prince, or even the elaborate banquets of an Eastern potentate. The air is thick with the scent of roasting meats, exotic spices, and expensive perfumes. Jewels glitter, music plays softly, and at the head of a long laden table sits the monarch, the embodiment of power and authority. And there you are, a trusted member of the inner circle, privileged to sample every delectable morsel before it reaches the royal lips. It sounds like a culinary dream job, a front row seat to power with the added perk of gourmet dining. You imagine savories and sweets, fine wines, and perhaps even a friendly chat with the king about the quality of the venison. But as you draw closer to this glittering scene, the reality begins to bite. Or rather, the fear of the bite begins to assert itself. This isn't about culinary appreciation, it's about mortal peril. Every dish placed before you, however artfully prepared, however enticingly aromatic, carries with it a silent, terrifying question. Is this the one? Is this the meal laced with nightshade, arsenic, or some other insidious concoction designed to dispatch your royal master, and by extension, you? That gilded cage of courtly life suddenly feels a lot more like a high-stakes game of Russian roulette, played with forks and spoons. The constant gnawing fear would be your unwelcome dining companion. You'd develop a heightened awareness, a sixth sense for anything amiss. The slightest unusual taste, a texture that's not quite right, a cook who seems a little too nervous. All would send alarm bells ringing in your highly stressed mind. You're not just tasting for flavor, you're tasting for death. And the pressure is immense. The life of the ruler, the stability of the kingdom, perhaps even the fate of an entire dynasty, could rest on your palate, your vigilance, and your willingness to be the first line of defense against a hidden enemy. This profession, as you'll soon discover, wasn't a flight of fancy from a paranoid monarch's dream. It was a very real and often very necessary role in many ancient and medieval courts, a testament to the perilous nature of power. Kings, queens, emperors, and sultans lived under constant threat of assassination, and poison was a favored weapon. Silent, often difficult to detect, at least initially, and easily administered through food or drink. The fear of being poisoned was not an irrational paranoia. It was a well-founded concern based on centuries of political intrigue, dynastic rivalries, and treacherous courtiers. This historical reality of poisoning as a tool for political assassination is a well-documented mainstream fact across many cultures and time periods. The individuals chosen for this perilous task were often, though not always, of humble origin, perhaps slaves, servants, or low-ranking officials. Their loyalty was paramount, but their lives were ultimately expendable. If they sickened or died after tasting a dish, it was a clear warning that the ruler should abstain. The taster, in essence, was a human poison detector, a living litmus test. It's a rather grim job description when you think about it. Wanted, individual with a discerning palate and a willingness to potentially die in agony. Perks include proximity to power and all the potentially poisoned food you can eat. The precise methods and rituals surrounding food tasting varied across cultures and time periods, but the underlying principle remained the same. Someone else had to take the first bite. The psychological toll on these individuals must have been enormous. Imagine living with that constant, low-level dread, never knowing if the next meal would be your last. The opulence of the court, the fine food, the proximity to power, all of these would be tainted by the ever-present shadow of the poisoned chalice. It is a subject of ongoing historical debate how effective food tasters actually were in preventing assassinations. Some poisons are slow-acting, their effects not immediately apparent. A clever poisoner might use a substance whose symptoms mimicked a common illness. And of course, a truly determined assassin might find other ways to reach their target. Nevertheless, the very presence of a food taster served as a deterrent and provided a measure of psychological comfort, however tenuous, to the ruler. So, as you settle into this world of gilded cages and carefully scrutinized suppers, try to imagine the knot in your stomach each time a new dish is presented. The rich sauces, the delicate pastries, the gleaming goblets of wine. They are not just culinary delights. They are potential instruments of death. And you are the first, and perhaps the last, line of defense. The glamour of the royal court quickly fades, replaced by the cold, hard reality of a job where every meal could be your last, and every bite is a gamble with fate. The glittering, yet deeply unnerving banquets of those anonymous royal courts begin to fade, and your sleepy historical journey now takes you further back, to the very roots of this perilous profession. The practice of employing someone to taste food and drink for potential poison is not a medieval invention. Its origins are ancient, stretching back to some of the earliest complex societies where rulers, acutely aware of their vulnerability, sought ways to protect themselves from hidden threats. You'll now journey back to the sun-drenched lands of ancient Rome and the even older civilization of Egypt, where the first official food tasters, the praegustatores and their earlier counterparts, walked a precarious tightrope between the intoxicating proximity to immense power and the ever-present, very real proximity to agonizing pain and death. Imagine yourself in the bustling, often treacherous corridors of power in ancient Rome, perhaps during the early imperial period. Emperors like Augustus, Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, and Nero lived in an atmosphere thick with political intrigue, conspiracies, and the constant fear of assassination. Poison was a well-understood and frequently employed tool for eliminating rivals or inconvenient family members. In this high-stakes environment, the praegustator, literally foretaster, became an essential, if unenviable, member of the imperial household. This role of the praegustator in Roman imperial courts is a well-established mainstream historical fact, mentioned by writers like Suetonius and Tacitus. These Roman food tasters were often slaves or freedmen, chosen for their perceived loyalty and, one assumes, their expendability. Their duty was to taste every dish and every beverage before it was served to the emperor or members of his immediate family. It wasn't just a quick nibble, it was a formal, observed process. The praegustator would sample a small portion of each item, often in the presence of other officials, and then a certain amount of time would be allowed to pass to see if any adverse effects manifested. If the taster remained healthy, the food was deemed safe for imperial consumption. If the taster sickened or died, well, the emperor knew to avoid that particular delicacy, and a swift, brutal investigation, and likely a fresh round of executions, would ensue. The story of Helotus, the praegustator to the Emperor Claudius, is a famous, if grim, example. Claudius himself was notoriously fearful of being poisoned, and with good reason, given the history of his family. Helotus served him for many years, presumably successfully navigating this dangerous role. However, when Claudius eventually died in 54 CE, many ancient sources, including Tacitus, claim he was poisoned by his ambitious wife Agrippina the Younger, mother of Nero, possibly with toxic mushrooms. The role of Halitus in this alleged poisoning is debated by historians. Some suggest he was complicit, deliberately serving the poisoned dish. Others argue he was simply outwitted, or that the poison was too subtle for him to detect immediately. Whatever the truth, the incident highlights the immense pressure and the often fatal consequences associated with the praegustator's job. Even if they performed their duties diligently, they could still be implicated in any successful poisoning, plot, or simply fail to detect a cleverly administered toxin. Now, let's drift even further back in time, down the Nile to ancient Egypt, a civilization that predates Rome by millennia. Here too, in the courts of the powerful pharaohs, the fear of assassination, including by poison, was very real. While the specific title of praegustator might not have been used, the function of a royal food taster undoubtedly existed. Given the divine status of the pharaoh and the elaborate rituals surrounding his person and his meals, it's highly probable that trusted servants were tasked with ensuring the safety of his food and drink. Tomb inscriptions and reliefs sometimes depict scenes of royal banquets with numerous attendants, and it's plausible that among them were individuals responsible for this vital, if perilous, duty. Egyptian medical papyri, like the Ebers papyrus, you might recall from other sleepy journeys, list various toxins and their effects, indicating a sophisticated, for the time, knowledge of poisons. This knowledge would have been available not only to healers, but also to those with malevolent intent. Therefore, protecting the pharaoh from such threats would have been a high priority. The individuals chosen for this task in Egypt, much like in Rome, were likely slaves or servants whose loyalty had been proven, or whose lives were considered less valuable than that of the divine ruler. One quirky, lesser-known aspect of ancient food protection might involve not just human tasters, but also the use of certain objects believed to detect or neutralize poisons. For example, some ancient cultures believed that vessels made of specific materials, or certain gemstones, like bezoar stones, which you also encountered, or even unicorn horns, narwhal tusks, in later periods, could change color or sweat in the presence of poison, or even render it harmless. While the scientific efficacy of such methods was nil, their use reflects the deep anxiety surrounding poisoning and the desperate search for any perceived safeguard. Whether Egyptian or early Roman courts employed such magical detectors alongside human tasters is less clear, but the belief in such properties was certainly present in the ancient world. The precise origins of the official food taster role are difficult to pinpoint with absolute certainty, as the fear of poisoning among rulers is likely as old as rulership itself. However, it's in these large, complex, and often politically volatile ancient empires like Egypt and Rome, with their concentrated power and documented courtly intrigue, that we see the position becoming more formalized and recognized. It was a grim necessity, a human shield against a hidden and often terrifying threat. So, as you imagine that Roman praegustator carefully sampling a dish of roasted dormice, or an Egyptian servant apprehensively sipping from a golden goblet before handing it to the pharaoh, you can feel the immense weight of their responsibility. They were the first line of defense, walking a daily tightrope. Proximity to power brought them into the glittering heart of the empire, but it also placed them squarely in the path of its deadliest intrigues. Theirs was a profession born of fear, sustained by mistrust, and often, tragically, ending in pain. The sun-drenched, marble-columned courts of Rome and the incense-filled halls of Egyptian pharaohs, with their ancient praegustatores and loyal, if terrified, servants, begin to fade into a cooler, damper, and distinctly more drafty atmosphere. The scent of olive oil and lotus blossoms is replaced by the aroma of wood smoke, roasting game, and perhaps a hint of mildew from damp stone walls. You find yourself stepping into a medieval castle, sometime between the 10th and 15th centuries. Here, in an age of often brutal dynastic struggles, treacherous vassals, and simmering political rivalries, Suspicion was a constant, unwelcome guest at every banquet table, and the royal food taster remained a key, if perpetually stressed and often unsung, member of the noble or royal household. Imagine the great hall of a medieval castle. Torches and tallow candles cast flickering, dancing shadows on the rough stone walls, perhaps hung with faded tapestries depicting heroic battles or hunting scenes. A long, heavy oak table dominates the room, laden with trenchers, slabs of stale, bread used as plates, pewter tankards, and perhaps a few precious silver goblets for the lord and his most honoured guests. The air is filled with the sounds of boisterous conversation, the clatter of knives. Forks were not yet in common use for dining in most of Europe. The growling of dogs under the table hoping for scraps, and perhaps the music of a minstrel in the gallery. At the head of the table, on a slightly raised dais, sits the king, duke, or powerful baron, his expression perhaps jovial, but his eyes ever watchful. In this turbulent age, where power was often seized and held by force, and where loyalty could be a fleeting commodity, the fear of poisoning remained a very real and present danger. A rival noble seeking to usurp your lands, a disgruntled vassal plotting rebellion, or even a jealous family member eyeing your inheritance, all might see poison as a convenient, discreet, and effective means to an end. Arsenic, the inheritance. Powder, as it was sometimes grimly known, was a popular choice. Difficult to detect by taste in small doses, yet deadly. Other plant-based toxins like hemlock, nightshade, or monkshood were also known and sometimes used. This persistent threat of poisoning among the medieval European nobility is a well-established mainstream historical fact. Therefore, the role of the food taster, known by various titles such as gustator, praegustator, a term inherited from Rome, essayeur, or simply taster, continued to be a vital one. This individual would be responsible for sampling each dish before it was served. To the lord or lady, the taster was often a trusted servant, perhaps a long-serving member of the household, or sometimes even a lower-ranking noble or squire whose loyalty was considered beyond question, or whose life was considered expendable enough. The process could be quite formal. Before each course was presented to the high table, the taster would step forward, perhaps under the watchful eye of the steward or marshal of the household. A small portion of each dish, the roast swan, the venison pasty, the spiced pottage, the sweet jellies, would be offered to them. They would consume it, and then a period of observation would follow. If, after a suitable interval, the taster showed no ill effects, no sudden stomach cramps, no vomiting, no convulsions, then, and only then, would the dish be deemed safe for the lord's consumption. You can imagine the silent, anxious moments as everyone waited to see if the taster would keel over. It certainly wouldn't do much for the appetite of the other diners. The taster's responsibilities might extend beyond just the food. The cupbearer, a role you'll explore in more detail later, was often responsible for tasting the wine or ale. But the general food taster might also be expected to scrutinize the preparation of the food, to observe the cooks in the kitchen, and to ensure that all ingredients were fresh and properly handled, not just to prevent poisoning, but also to avoid accidental foodborne illness, which in an age of rudimentary hygiene and food preservation was another constant threat. One quirky, lesser-known aspect of medieval food tasting might involve the use of specific testing utensils or objects. While the primary method was direct tasting, some accounts suggest that certain items, like pieces of unicorn horn, narwhal tusk, as you might recall, believed to sweat or change color in the presence of poison, or stones like bezoars or serpents, tongue, fossilized shark teeth, might be dipped into dishes or drinks as a preliminary test. These objects were often highly prized and incredibly expensive, their perceived efficacy rooted more in superstition and folklore than in any scientific reality. The exact extent to which these magical detectors were relied upon versus the grim pragmatism of a human taster is difficult to ascertain and likely varied greatly. But their existence highlights the pervasive fear and the desire for any perceived protection. It is a subject of ongoing historical discussion, how often food tasters actually did detect poison or fall victim to it in medieval courts. Successful, poisoning certainly occurred, as history attests. But a competent taster, combined with other security measures in the kitchen and at the table, likely acted as a significant deterrent. The mere presence of a taster made any attempt at poisoning far more complicated and risky for the would-be assassin. So, as you sit in that drafty medieval great hall, the torches guttering, the hounds snarling under the table, and the lord nervously eyeing his trencher of boar's head, you see the food taster, perhaps a pale and perpetually anxious individual, diligently performing their perilous duty. Theirs is a life lived on the edge, a constant gamble with fate. Every lavish feast, every celebratory banquet is for them an occasion not of joy, but of heightened vigilance and potential agony. The morsels of mistrust served up in these turbulent times were a grim reminder that even the most powerful rulers were vulnerable, and that the price of their security was often paid, one tentative, fearful bite at a time, by someone else. The flickering torchlight of that drafty medieval castle, with its perpetually stressed food taster nervously eyeing each dish, begins to coalesce into a more focused image of the tasting process itself. You'd quickly learn, as you observe, this high-stakes culinary ritual, that the role of the royal, or noble, food taster involved far more than just a casual, surreptitious nibble of the king's roast pheasant, or a quick sip from his goblet. No, this was often a formal, meticulously choreographed and highly visible ceremony, laden with immense responsibility for the ruler's physical safety and, by extension, the stability of the realm. The ritual itself was a performance of vigilance, a public declaration that the lord was protected, even if that protection rested on the precarious health of one unfortunate individual. Imagine the scene as a grand banquet is about to be served. The high table is set with the finest linens, gleaming, if anachronistic for some earlier periods, silver or gold plate, and ornate drinking vessels. The air is thick with anticipation, not just for the food, but for the entire spectacle. Before any dish reaches the royal presence, it would undergo a series of checks, and finally, the crucial tasting. This wasn't done discreetly in a back room. It was often part of the public presentation of the meal. The individual entrusted with this task, the praegustator or essayeur, might be a specific, designated officer of the household. In some courts, this role was one of considerable trust and could even carry a degree of status, despite its inherent dangers. The taster would approach the dish, perhaps presented by the royal carver or sewer, the official responsible for overseeing the serving of dishes. They might employ specific utensils, sometimes made of silver or other materials believed to react to certain poisons, though this, as you know, was more superstition than science. The mainstream historical fact is that the primary detector was the taster's own body. The tasting itself could be quite ritualized. The taster might take a small, deliberate portion of each component of the dish. If it was a complex pottage or a pie, they would need to sample various parts to ensure no poison was cleverly concealed. They might hold the food in their mouth for a moment, noting any unusual bitterness, metallic taste, or numbing sensation, all potential indicators of certain common poisons. Then they would swallow. And then everyone would wait. This waiting period was crucial. Some poisons act quickly, causing immediate distress. Others might take longer to manifest symptoms. The length of this observation period before the ruler partook would vary, but it would undoubtedly be a tense few minutes, or longer, for all concerned, especially the taster. The responsibility was enormous. If the taster failed to detect a poison and the ruler fell ill or died, the consequences for the taster, if they somehow survived, would be dire. Accusations of negligence, complicity, or treason would swiftly follow, likely leading to a very unpleasant end. Conversely, if the taster falsely declared a dish safe, or if they themselves were the poisoner, a not unheard of scenario in the annals of courtly intrigue, they held the ruler's life directly in their hands. The psychological burden of this constant vigilance, knowing that a single mistake or a moment of inattention could have catastrophic results, must have been immense. The ritual wasn't just about detecting poison, it was also about demonstrating loyalty and trust. The very act of a servant willingly, publicly, putting their own life on the line for their master was a powerful symbol. It reinforced the ruler's authority and the idea that he was surrounded by faithful retainers. For the assembled courtiers and guests, witnessing the tasting ceremony was a reminder of the ever-present dangers faced by those in power and the measures taken to protect them. In some highly formalized courts, particularly in later medieval and Renaissance Europe, the entire process of serving the royal meal, from the kitchen to the table, was a carefully orchestrated ballet of security. Dishes might be covered and sealed in the kitchen, only to be unsealed at the table in the presence of the taster. Multiple individuals might be involved in different stages of the preparation and serving, each one a potential point of scrutiny. The food taster was the final, critical link in this chain of protection. One quirky, lesser-known aspect of the tasting ritual might involve the specific order in which dishes were tasted, or even the taster's own dietary restrictions or perceived sensitivities. Perhaps a taster known to have a delicate stomach might be considered more reliable, as they would presumably react more quickly, or obviously to tainted food. Or maybe certain safer dishes, prepared under close supervision, might bypass the full tasting ritual, though this would be a risky gamble. The precise protocols and the level of adherence to them would likely have varied significantly depending on the ruler's level of paranoia, the current political climate, and the specific traditions of the court. Historians continue to debate the exact level of ritualization versus pragmatic, ad hoc tasting in different historical contexts. Consider the sheer number of dishes at a major medieval or Renaissance banquet, each one requiring tasting, each one a potential threat. The taster would need a strong constitution, a discerning, if perpetually anxious, palate, and nerves of steel. They were not just sampling food, they were sampling fate, one mouthful at a time. The weight of the crown, in a very real sense, rested on the sensitivity of their taste buds and the resilience of their digestive system. This was not a job for the faint of heart, or for anyone with a picky appetite. The ritual and responsibility of the royal food taster made every meal a potential drama, a life or death performance played out before the attentive, and often equally nervous, gaze of the entire court. The solemn, ritualized procession of dishes, each one carefully sampled by the anxious royal taster, now leads you to ponder a more specific and rather unsettling question. What exactly were they tasting for? Beyond a general fear of poison, what were the specific substances, the insidious concoctions that haunted the dreams of monarchs and kept their food tasters perpetually on edge? As you delve into the shadowy pharmacopoeia of historical poisons, you discover a grim catalogue of threats, ranging from common, easily accessible plant-based toxins to more sophisticated, deliberately administered substances designed to kill silently, painfully, or with a chilling, untraceable subtlety. One of the most infamous and widely feared poisons throughout ancient and medieval times, as you've briefly heard, was arsenic. Often referred to as the king of poisons or inheritance powder, white arsenic, arsenic trioxide, was particularly insidious because it was odorless, tasteless in small quantities, or easily masked by other flavors. And its symptoms, severe. Abdominal pain, vomiting, diarrhea, convulsions, could mimic those of common illnesses like cholera or dysentery, making diagnosis, and therefore detection of foul play, incredibly difficult, especially before the development of reliable chemical tests like the Marsh test in the 19th century. This difficulty in detecting arsenic and its use in historical poisonings is a well-established mainstream historical fact. A food taster might not notice anything amiss with the initial taste of an arsenic-laced dish, only to fall violently ill hours later, by which time the royal target might also have consumed the fatal meal. Plant-based toxins were also a common threat, readily available from the natural world if one knew where to look or who to ask. Hemlock, famously used to execute the philosopher Socrates in ancient Athens, causes paralysis and respiratory failure. Monkshood, also known as aconite or wolfsbane, is another highly toxic plant, containing alkaloids that affect the heart and nervous system, leading to a swift and painful death. Nightshade, belladonna, with its attractive but deadly berries, could cause delirium, hallucinations, and eventually coma and death. Foxglove, digitalis, while a source of important heart medication in modern times, is highly toxic in larger doses, causing severe cardiac disturbances. A food taster would need to be wary of any unusual bitterness or unexpected botanical ingredients in a dish, though many of these toxins could be cleverly disguised. Heavy metals, besides arsenic, also posed a threat. Mercury compounds, like corrosive sublimate, mercuric chloride, were known for their toxicity. Antimony was another substance that could be used as a poison. These might be introduced into food or drink, often causing violent gastrointestinal symptoms. The challenge for the taster was that the initial taste might not always reveal the danger, especially if the poison was present in small but cumulative doses over time, a method sometimes employed for a slower, less suspicious assassination. Then there were animal-based poisons, though perhaps less commonly used in European, courtly intrigue than plant or mineral toxins. Cantharides, derived from the blister beetle, often called Spanish fly, was known as a supposed aphrodisiac, but is actually highly toxic, causing severe irritation to the urinary tract and other internal organs. Certain types of toadstools, or poisonous mushrooms, as allegedly used against Emperor Claudius, were another obvious danger, easily mistaken for edible varieties by an unwary cook, or deliberately introduced by a poisoner. Beyond these natural poisons, there was always the fear of more sophisticated or deliberately compounded poisons, perhaps prepared by an alchemist or a skilled apothecary with malevolent intent. The precise nature of these concoctions is often shrouded in mystery and folklore, but they would have been designed to be as undetectable and effective as possible. The Renaissance, in particular, had a reputation, perhaps somewhat exaggerated, as an age of cunning poisoners, with Italian families like the Borgias becoming legendary for their alleged expertise in this dark art. The fear of subtle, slow-acting poisons that could mimic natural illness was particularly potent, as it made the taster's job even more difficult and uncertain. It wasn't just deliberate poisoning that the taster had to guard against. Accidental contamination was also a constant concern. In an era with rudimentary food hygiene, poor sanitation, and limited understanding of bacteriology, food could easily become tainted with harmful microbes, leading to severe food poisoning. The taster, by sampling everything, was also acting as a first line of defense against spoiled meat, contaminated water, or improperly prepared dishes that could incapacitate the ruler just as effectively as a deliberate poison, even if the intent wasn't malicious. The distinction between accidental food poisoning and deliberate poisoning could often be blurry, adding another layer of anxiety and potential accusation. One quirky, lesser-known concern might involve the use of certain magical or sympathetic poisons, where the belief was that an object or substance associated with the victim, if treated in a certain way, could cause them harm. While a food taster couldn't directly guard against such curses, the general atmosphere of fear surrounding all forms of malevolent magic would have contributed to the overall paranoia about anything unusual in the royal food. The precise extent to which belief in purely magical poisoning, as opposed to physical toxins, influenced the role of the food taster is hard to quantify, but likely formed part of the background anxiety. So, as the royal food taster, your palate wasn't just discerning flavors. It was a chemical detector, a botanical expert, and a toxicologist, all rolled into one very stressed individual. You'd be on high alert for the bitter tang of hemlock, the metallic hint of arsenic, if it could even be tasted, the unexpected grittiness of a ground mineral, or the subtle signs of spoilage that could signal a less sinister but equally debilitating threat. Every meal was an examination, every mouthful a potential encounter with a hidden enemy. The menu of potential perils was alarmingly long and varied, making the taster's job not just dangerous, but also incredibly demanding in terms of sensory awareness and, one imagines, a very robust digestive system. The grim litany of potential poisons, the tasteless arsenic, the bitter hemlock, the insidious heavy metals, still sends a shiver down your spine as you contemplate the royal food taster's perilous profession. Now, let's delve into the heart of this strange arrangement, the guinea pig paradox that defined the taster's existence. You'd explore the incredibly complex and often deeply fraught relationship between the taster and their royal employer, a dynamic built on a precarious foundation of supposed trust, ever-present suspicion of treachery, and the often rudimentary, sometimes outright superstitious, methods used to detect poison beyond the taster's own sacrificial palate. Imagine the scene. You, the royal taster, have just sampled a particularly suspicious-looking dish. All eyes in the grand hall are upon you, but none more intently than those of the monarch whose life depends on your reaction. This relationship between the ruler and the taster was a bizarre blend of intimacy and expendability. The taster was brought into the innermost circle, privy to the royal meals, a constant presence at the most private of functions. Yet, this proximity was born not of affection, but of fear. The ruler trusted the taster only in the sense that they trusted the taster's body to react to poison before their own did. It was a trust based on the taster's biological vulnerability. A chillingly pragmatic arrangement. Who were these tasters? As you know, they were often slaves, servants, or low-ranking individuals whose lives were considered less valuable. Their loyalty might be cultivated through rewards, a slightly better standard of living than their peers, or perhaps the fear of even worse alternatives. But could a ruler ever truly trust someone whose job it was to die in their stead? What if the taster was bribed, or coerced, or held a hidden grudge? The paranoia must have been relentless for both parties. The taster lived in constant fear of the food, and the ruler lived in constant fear of the taster's potential fallibility or treachery. This inherent tension in the master-taster relationship is a key psychological aspect of this historical role. Beyond simply relying on the taster to sicken or die, were there other tools or methods used to detect poison? Yes, but their efficacy was often highly questionable. You've already encountered some of the superstitious detectors: the unicorn horn, narwhal tusk, bezoar stones, calcifications from animal stomachs, or serpent's tongues, fossilized shark teeth. These were believed to sweat, change color, shatter, or neutralize poisons upon contact. Such items, often encased in elaborate gold or silver settings, would be dipped into food or wine. The belief in these magical antidotes or detectors was widespread, a mainstream historical fact of medieval and Renaissance courts, reflecting a desperate desire for any perceived safeguard. A food taster might even be responsible for administering these tests before taking their own fateful bite, adding another layer of ritual and false hope to the proceedings. Silver was another material widely believed to react to certain poisons, particularly arsenic and some sulfur-based compounds, by tarnishing or turning black. Therefore, royal cutlery, plates, and goblets were often made of silver, not just for their intrinsic value, but also as a supposed passive poison detection system. A taster might be instructed to observe the silver for any unusual discoloration after it came into contact with the food. While some chemical reactions could indeed cause silver to tarnish, it was hardly a reliable or universal poison test. Some rulers employed animals as supplementary tasters. Small dogs, cats, or even birds might be fed scraps from the royal table, before or alongside the human taster. The idea was that these animals, with their smaller body mass, might react more quickly or visibly to certain toxins. This practice, while perhaps offering a slight additional layer of perceived security, again highlights the grim, expendable nature of those chosen, human or animal, to be the first line of defense. The preparation of the food itself would be subject to intense scrutiny. Royal kitchens were often heavily guarded, access restricted to trusted personnel. Ingredients would be carefully sourced and inspected. The head cook, as you'll explore later, bore immense responsibility. However, even with the tightest security, a determined poisoner with access to the kitchen, or one who could bribe a disgruntled servant could still find opportunities. This is where the human taster became the final, fallible checkpoint. One quirky, lesser-known tool in the taster's arsenal might have been their own accumulated, albeit often unscientific knowledge of common ailments and their symptoms. A taster who had served for many years might develop a keen sense of what looked off or smelled unusual, or they might recognize the early symptoms of certain common illnesses that could be confused with poisoning, perhaps preventing a false alarm, or conversely, leading to a tragically incorrect reassurance. The precise level of expertise a food taster might have possessed, beyond a sensitive palate and a strong stomach, is a subject of historical speculation, as they were rarely formally trained physicians. It's a strange paradox, isn't it? The taster's life was predicated on the ruler's mistrust of everyone else, yet the ruler had to place a life-or-death trust in the taster's senses and loyalty. And the taster, in turn, had to trust that the rudimentary or magical tools and their own vigilance would be enough to save them from a poisoned dish, while simultaneously knowing that their primary function was to be the one who suffered first. This complex web of trust, treachery, fear, and reliance defined the guinea pig existence of the royal food taster, a role where every meal was a test, and the tools for passing that test were often as much about superstition and hope as they were about any reliable science. The precarious trust between ruler and taster, and the often dubious tools used to detect poison, now bring you to the most critical and certainly most dramatic moment in this perilous profession. What happened if the taster actually did react badly? Imagine the scene. You, the royal food taster, have just taken that fateful bite of the king's specially prepared venison, or sipped from his jeweled goblet of wine. A few tense moments pass, the assembled court watching you with bated breath. And then it begins. A sudden pallor, a sheen of sweat on your brow, a lurch in your stomach, a gasp for air, or perhaps even a terrifying convulsion. The worst has happened. The food, it seems, was indeed tainted. The immediate consequences. For you would be grim, but your suffering would also unleash a wave of panic, suspicion, and frantic investigation within the royal household. The first and most immediate consequence, of course, would be your own agony. Depending on the poison used, you might experience excruciating abdominal cramps, violent vomiting and diarrhea, difficulty breathing, a burning sensation in your throat, dizziness, paralysis, or seizures. There would be no gentle ER to rush you to, no stomach pumps, no advanced life support. The court physician, if present, might rush to your side, but his remedies would likely be ineffective against a potent, fast-acting poison. He might administer emetics to induce further vomiting, or try to feed you supposed antidotes like milk, olive oil, or one of those dubious concoctions made from bezoar stones or unicorn horn you heard about earlier. But more often than not, these efforts would be futile. Your primary role in this horrific scenario was to be the undeniable, suffering proof that the meal was deadly. As you writhed in pain, or perhaps collapsed unconscious, a wave of controlled panic, or perhaps not so controlled, depending on the court, would sweep through the hall. The ruler, your royal master, would immediately be hustled away from the table, his own meal untouched. The offending dish, and likely all other food from that course, would be instantly declared suspect and removed. Guards would be on high alert, doors might be sealed, no one would be allowed to leave. The festive atmosphere of the banquet would transform in an instant into a scene of fear, suspicion, and grim anticipation. This sudden shift from feasting to fear upon a taster's adverse reaction is a dramatic but logical consequence, often depicted in historical accounts and fiction. An immediate and ruthless investigation would begin. Who had access to the kitchen? Who prepared this specific dish? Who served it? Who was seen near the royal table? Every cook, every servant, every page, every cupbearer who had even the remotest connection to the tainted food would fall under intense scrutiny. The chief steward, the master of the household, and perhaps even the captain of the guard would lead the interrogation. And interrogation, in those days, especially when the life of a ruler was at stake, often involved methods that were far from gentle. Torture to extract confessions was a common and accepted practice in most ancient and medieval legal systems when dealing with crimes like treason or attempted regicide. The search for the poisoner would be relentless and often wide-ranging. Was it an inside job? A treacherous member of the household bought off by an enemy? Was it an external plot? A foreign agent or a political rival who had managed to infiltrate the kitchens? Accusations would fly. Old grudges and simmering rivalries within the court could easily surface, with individuals trying to deflect blame or implicate their enemies. It would be a dangerous time for anyone who had ever made a misstep or attracted the ire of someone powerful. One quirky, lesser-known aspect of such an investigation might involve the immediate testing of the remaining food, perhaps by feeding it to other animals, if any were on hand and hadn't already been used as preliminary tasters, or by applying those aforementioned magical poison detectors with even greater urgency. The court physician might try to identify the poison based on your symptoms, though his knowledge would be limited by the medical understanding of the era. The precise methods used to investigate a suspected poisoning in a royal household and the often political motivations that could influence such investigations are fascinating, if grim, subjects for historians who study courtly intrigue. And what of your fate, the unfortunate taster, as you lay there, suffering or dying? If you succumbed, your death would be the ultimate confirmation of the plot. Your body might even be examined for further clues. If, by some miracle, you survived the initial effects, perhaps the dose was small, or your constitution particularly strong, or the poison was merely a severe case of accidental food poisoning, your future would still be precarious. You would be a key witness, of course, but also potentially a suspect. Did you deliberately ingest a small amount to warn the king? Or were you part of the plot and only pretended to be more affected than you were? Your survival could be as dangerous as your death. The fear and paranoia in the aftermath of such an incident would be immense. Security would be tightened. Every meal for weeks, perhaps months, would be an even more fraught and terrifying ordeal for whoever was next appointed to the role of taster, if anyone dared to take the job. Trust within the court would be shattered. The ruler would be even more suspicious, more isolated, more fearful. Your personal agony, your sacrifice, willing or unwilling, would have ripple effects, sending tremors of fear and suspicion throughout the entire gilded cage of the royal court. Surviving the supper, for you, meant failing in your primary, if dreadful, duty as a living warning sign. The grim scene of your agonizing reaction to that tainted dish and the ensuing panic within the royal household slowly fades. The focus shifts slightly from the solid food on the king's plate to the liquid in his cup. For just as the royal food taster faced daily peril with every mouthful, another, equally crucial and often equally stressed member of the court performed a similar life or death duty, the royal cupbearer. We now shift our sleepy gaze to this trusted individual, whose role involved not just serving the monarch's wine, ale, or water, but also ensuring, often by taking the first sip himself, that the royal goblet remained untainted by poison. This was a position of immense trust, proximity to power, and, of course, considerable personal risk, a liquid loyalty that could have a very bitter aftertaste. Imagine the scene at a royal banquet, or even during a private meal. The king calls for a drink. The cupbearer, an elegantly dressed and often high-ranking individual, sometimes a young nobleman or a particularly favoured servant, steps forward. He might be responsible for selecting the wine from the royal cellars, overseeing its journey to the table, and then, the crucial part, pouring it into the king's ornate goblet. Perhaps a jewelled gold chalice or a delicate glass vessel. But before the king raises the cup to his lips, the cupbearer would often perform his most important and most dangerous function. He would taste it. This tasting was not a casual sip. Like the food taster's ritual, it could be quite formal. The cupbearer might pour a small amount of the beverage into a separate, smaller cup, his tasting cup, or chiathus in some contexts. and drink from it in full view of the monarch and any assembled company. Then again, there would be that tense waiting period. All eyes would be on the cupbearer. Did he show any signs of distress? Did the wine have an unusual taste or smell that he might discreetly signal? If all seemed well, the king would then drink. The cupbearer's role as a taster of royal beverages is a well-documented mainstream historical fact, appearing in royal courts across many cultures, from ancient Persia and Rome to medieval and Renaissance Europe. Nehemiah, in the Hebrew Bible, famously served as cupbearer to King Artaxerxes of Persia, a position of considerable influence. The cupbearer was often more than just a poison detector. This was a position of great intimacy and trust. The cupbearer had direct, frequent access to the ruler, often in private settings. They were privy to conversations. They observed the king's moods, and they could become confidants or even advisors. Because of this close relationship, cupbearers were sometimes chosen from noble families, or they were individuals whose loyalty was believed to be absolute. They were often well-educated, cultured, and possessed of diplomatic skills. The position could be a stepping stone to greater power and influence within the court. However, this proximity to power also made them prime targets or potential instruments in any poisoning plot. If a cupbearer could be bribed, coerced, or was himself disloyal, he was perfectly placed to administer a fatal draught. Therefore, the selection of a cupbearer was a matter of utmost importance, and their actions would be constantly, if subtly, scrutinized. The trust placed in them was immense, but it was a trust always shadowed by the possibility of betrayal. What were they tasting for? Many of the same poisons that could be administered in food could also be dissolved in liquids. Arsenic, certain plant alkaloids, or even finely ground glass, intended to cause internal injuries rather than true poisoning, but equally deadly. Some poisons might be more easily disguised in strongly flavored wine or ale. The cupbearer would need a keen sense of taste and smell, and an awareness of any subtle changes in the appearance or clarity of the beverage. One quirky, lesser-known aspect of the cupbearer's role might involve the ceremonial handling and care of the royal drinking vessels themselves. These were often incredibly valuable objects, made of precious metals and adorned with jewels. The cupbearer would be responsible for their safekeeping and ensuring they were kept clean and untainted. There might even be specific rituals for washing or purifying the royal goblet before each use, adding another layer to the security measures. The idea that certain vessels might themselves possess poison-detecting properties, like those unicorn horn cups, could also play into the cupbearer's duties, perhaps requiring them to perform specific tests with the cup itself. It is a subject of ongoing historical discussion how often cupbearers, like food tasters, actually fell victim to poisoned drinks intended for their masters. Given their position, they were undoubtedly at high risk. If a cupbearer suddenly became ill after tasting the royal wine, the alarm would be raised instantly, the king would be warned, and the unfortunate cupbearer would become Exhibit A in the ensuing investigation. His suffering, or death, would be the price of his liquid loyalty. The psychological pressure on the cupbearer must have been immense, similar to that on the food taster. Every cup poured, every sip taken, was a gamble. The trust of the monarch was a heavy burden, and the knowledge that a single mistake, a moment of inattention, or a cleverly disguised poison could lead to their own agonizing death, and potentially the death of their ruler, would have been a constant source of stress. So, as you picture that elegantly attired cupbearer, his hand perhaps trembling slightly as he raises the tasting cup to his lips, you see another facet of that gilded cage of royal service. The honor of serving the king so intimately, of being a trusted confidant, was inextricably linked to the daily, terrifying duty of being his first line of defense against a poisoned chalice. It was a role that demanded not just a refined palate, but nerves of steel and an unwavering, potentially fatal loyalty. The image of the loyal, if perpetually nervous, royal cupbearer, carefully tasting the king's wine, begins to recede, and your sleepy thoughts drift towards another, related aspect of this constant battle against poison in ancient and medieval courts. The often desperate and frequently dubious search for defenses against these hidden threats. While food tasters and cupbearers provided a human shield, rulers and nobles also sought other means of protection, often turning to alchemists, physicians, and purveyors of magical charms who whispered promises of universal antidotes, poison detecting, amulets, and other, often bizarre and largely ineffective, defenses against a painful and untimely death. You now peek into this shadowy world of alchemical antidotes and dubious deterrents, where hope and superstition often trumped science and sense. Imagine a medieval king or a Renaissance prince, his mind filled with anxieties about treacherous courtiers and hidden enemies. He summons his most learned physician or a secretive alchemist, demanding a way to protect himself from the ever-present threat of poison. What would they offer? In an era before modern toxicology and pharmacology, the cures and preventatives were often a curious blend of empirical observation. Some herbal remedies did have limited efficacy for certain ailments, if not true poisons, magical thinking, and outright quackery. One of the most sought-after, almost mythical substances was the universal antidote, sometimes called etheriac or mithridate. These were complex concoctions, often containing dozens or even hundreds of ingredients, including rare herbs, animal parts, like viper's flesh, a common ingredient in theriac, minerals, and sometimes even gemstones ground into powder. The recipes were often closely guarded secrets, passed down through generations of physicians or alchemists. The belief was that such a potent and complex mixture could counteract any known poison. Famous historical figures, like Mithridates, Figes of Pontus, from whom Mithridate gets its name, were said to have regularly dosed themselves with such concoctions, hoping to build up an immunity to poisons. This pursuit of a universal antidote, a panacea against all toxins, is a well-documented mainstream historical fact, reflecting both the fear of poisoning and the limited understanding of how different poisons actually worked. While some ingredients in these theriacs might have had mild emetic or purgative effects, their ability to neutralize potent poisons like arsenic or hemlock was virtually non-existent. Then there were the amulets and talismans, specifically designed to detect or ward off poison. You've already encountered the belief in unicorn horns, narwhal tusks, bezoar stones, and serpent's tongues, fossilized shark teeth. These were often mounted in elaborate settings of gold or silver and worn as jewelry, or incorporated into drinking vessels. The idea was that these substances, imbued with magical or natural virtue, would react in the presence of poison, perhaps by sweating, changing color, shattering, or even causing the poisoned liquid to bubble or foam. Kings and nobles would pay exorbitant sums for such items, their rarity and exotic origins adding to their mystique and perceived power. Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, reportedly owned a unicorn horn that was considered one of his most precious treasures. The trade in these magical poison detectors was a lucrative, if often fraudulent, business. Certain gemstones were also believed to have protective qualities against poison. Emeralds, sapphires, and amethysts were sometimes thought to shatter or lose their luster if they came near a poisoned substance. Wearing rings or pendants set with these stones was seen as a form of personal protection. Again, there was no scientific basis for these beliefs, but in a world desperate for safeguards, any perceived advantage was eagerly embraced. The behavior of animals, as you've seen with supplementary tasters, could also be seen as a defense. If a caged bird near the dining table suddenly died, or if the king's favorite dog refused to eat a scrap of food offered from the royal plate, it might be taken as a warning sign. This reliance on animal sensitivity, while perhaps more grounded in observation than a belief in magical stones, was still an unreliable method. One quirky, lesser-known defense might involve specific rituals or prayers to be performed before meals, invoking divine protection against hidden dangers in the seven food or drink. These might be combined with the use of blessed salt or water sprinkled over the food, or the making of the sign of the cross over each dish in Christian courts. While primarily religious in nature, these practices also served a psychological purpose, offering a sense of spiritual armor against the threat of poisoning. The precise nature of these mealtime protective rituals and how they varied across cultures and religious traditions is a fascinating area for folklorists and historians of religion. It is a subject of ongoing scholarly debate how much genuine belief rulers and their advisors placed in these often dubious defenses versus how much their use was about projecting an image of being well protected and invulnerable, thereby deterring potential poisoners. Perhaps it was a bit of both. A genuine hope that these measures might work, combined with a pragmatic understanding of their psychological value. So, as you imagine that alchemist in his cluttered, smoky laboratory, surrounded by strange alembics, bubbling concoctions, and esoteric texts, promising his royal patron an infallible antidote, or the court jeweler proudly presenting a newly acquired unicorn horn set in gold, you see a world grasping at straws in the face of a terrifying and often invisible threat. The food taster might be the first line of physical defense, but these alchemical antidotes and magical charms represented a kind of second line, a desperate hope that science, such as it was, magic, or divine intervention, could offer a shield against the ever-present fear of a poisoned demise. The effectiveness was questionable, but the peace of mind they offered, however illusory, was perhaps priceless to a ruler living in constant dread. The shadowy alchemist's laboratory, with its bubbling concoctions and promises of dubious universal antidotes, begins to fade, and your sleepy understanding of the food taster's perilous profession broadens. You'd come to realize that this nerve-wracking job, this constant dicing with death at the dinner table, wasn't exclusively reserved for those who served kings, queens, emperors, or pharaohs. While monarchs, being the ultimate targets, certainly employed such safeguards most conspicuously, the fear of poison was a pervasive anxiety that trickled down the social hierarchy. Lesser nobles, powerful church officials, wealthy merchants, and anyone who perceived themselves as having enemies or valuable assets to protect might also employ individuals, formally or informally, to taste their food and drink, creating a wider, if less documented, web of tasters for notables across various echelons of a paranoid society. Imagine a powerful medieval baron in his fortified castle, hosting a banquet for his neighboring lords, some of whom might be rivals for land or influence, or picture a wealthy Renaissance banker in his Florentine palazzo, negotiating a sensitive deal with cutthroat competitors. In such environments, where political maneuvering, commercial rivalries, and personal vendettas could easily turn deadly, the fear of a poisoned meal was not an unreasonable one. While they might not have had the elaborate state-funded tasting rituals of a royal court, these lesser notables would still have taken precautions. The taster in such a household might not always bear a formal title like praegustator. It could be a trusted personal servant, a loyal bodyguard, or even a family member of lower status, who was always served first from any communal dish, or who was expected to take the first sip from a shared wine pitcher. The arrangement might be less a public ceremony and more a discreet, understood protocol within the household. The principle, however, remained the same. Someone else's digestive system was the first line of defense. This informal use of trusted servants or family members for tasting, especially in noble households below the royal level, is a plausible, if less formally documented, extension of the practice. Consider the powerful prince-bishops of the Holy Roman Empire, or the wealthy abbots of influential monasteries during the Middle Ages. These individuals wielded considerable secular and religious power, controlled vast estates, and were often deeply embroiled in political intrigues. They too would have been prime targets for assassination by poison, and would likely have employed trusted members of their extensive households to ensure the safety of their meals. The chronicles of monastic life or ecclesiastical courts sometimes hint at such internal security measures. Even in the fiercely competitive world of Renaissance Italian city-states, where families like the Medici, the Sforza, or the Borgias vied for power, the fear of poison was legendary. Machiavelli, in The Prince, discusses the various ways rulers can be undone, and treachery within one's own court was a constant theme. In such an atmosphere, anyone with significant power or wealth would have been foolish not to take precautions with their food and drink. The employment of tasters or at least highly vigilant servants overseeing food preparation and service, would have been a standard operating procedure. One quirky, lesser-known aspect of this wider fear of poisoning might involve the precautions taken by travelers, especially wealthy merchants or emissaries journeying through unfamiliar or hostile territories. They might carry their own trusted servants to prepare and taste their food, or be extremely wary of accepting hospitality from strangers, or even from seemingly friendly local potentates whose motives might be suspect. The risk of being poisoned, while a guest in someone else's territory, was a real concern, adding another layer of anxiety to ancient and medieval travel. The precise extent to which ordinary travelers, even wealthy ones, employed dedicated tasters versus relying on general caution and trusted personal servants is difficult to ascertain, but the underlying fear was certainly there. It's also important to consider that the taster wasn't always human. Wealthy households might keep dogs or other pets that were deliberately fed scraps from the table, their reactions observed. While not a foolproof system, it was another layer in the often improvised defenses against a hidden threat. The historical evidence for food tasters employed by non-royal notables is often more anecdotal and less formally documented than for royal courts. We might find references in personal letters, household account books, or satirical literature that hints at such practices. But the logic is compelling. If the king feared poison, why wouldn't the duke, the bishop, or the wealthy merchant, who also had enemies and ambitions? The fear was contagious, and the solution, however grim, likely spread with it. So, as you imagine these less grand, but no less anxious dining scenes, the baron in his drafty hall, the merchant in his counting house, the abbot in his refectory, you see the shadow of the food taster extending beyond the glittering throne rooms. It was a profession, or at least a precautionary practice, born of a pervasive paranoia, a recognition that power and wealth, at any level, attracted danger. The morsels of mistrust were not just served on royal tables. They were a feature of any dinner where the stakes were high and the company potentially treacherous. The fear of a fatal supper was an anxiety that many notables, not just crowned heads, had to swallow. The image of anxious nobles and wealthy merchants employing their own discreet food tasters, extending the shadow of this perilous profession beyond the royal court, now leads us to confront a rather stark reality. Despite all the precautions, the dedicated human tasters, the ritualized sampling, the unicorn horns, the silver goblets, the vigilant cupbearers, sometimes the poison still found its mark. We now calmly recall some of those infamous historical instances where, despite the best efforts of these elaborate defenses, feasts turned fatal and poison successfully reached its intended royal or noble target, with dramatic, often devastating consequences for individuals, dynasties, and even the course of history. The annals of ancient and medieval history are, unfortunately, peppered with tales of suspected or confirmed poisonings of powerful figures. These events often sent shockwaves through their societies, sparking fear, instability, and frequently bloody retribution. You've already heard about the alleged poisoning of the Roman Emperor Claudius by his wife Agrippina, supposedly using tainted mushrooms, a case where his food taster Halitus was either complicit or outwitted. This incident, whether entirely factual in all its lurid details as recounted by Tacitus, highlights the vulnerability of even the most powerful rulers. It remains a classic example of how poison could be used in high-stakes dynastic struggles, and the historical debate continues regarding the exact circumstances of Claudius's death. Consider the medieval period in Europe. Kings and powerful nobles often lived in a state of heightened alert. The story of King John of England, who died in 1216, is a case in point. While the official cause of his death was dysentery, rumours persisted for centuries that he had been poisoned perhaps by monks at Swineshead Abbey with whom he had quarrelled. Though modern historical analysis largely discredits the poisoning theory in John's case, the very fact that such rumours could arise and persist for so long underscores the prevalent fear and plausibility of such an end for a controversial monarch. The Italian Renaissance, as you know, has a particularly lurid reputation for sophisticated poisonings, often associated with powerful families like the Borgias. Pope Alexander VI, Rodrigo Borgia, and his son Cesare Borgia were widely rumored to employ poison, particularly cantarella, a supposed arsenic-based concoction, though its exact composition is unknown, to eliminate their political rivals and consolidate their power. While some of these tales are undoubtedly exaggerated by their enemies, the sheer number of sudden, convenient deaths among those who crossed the Borgias fueled these dark legends. The banquet given by Cesare Borgia in 1503, where several cardinals fell ill and one died, with both Cesare and his father also becoming severely ill. Alexander VI died shortly thereafter, is a famous, if murky, episode often attributed to an accidental self-poisoning or a misdirected plot. This association of the Borgias with poisoning, whether entirely accurate or partly a product of hostile propaganda, is a deeply ingrained mainstream historical image. Even when tasters were present, a sufficiently clever or determined poisoner might find a way. Perhaps the poison was slow-acting, its effects not apparent until long after the taster had sampled the dish, or it could be administered in a way that bypassed the taster. For example, a poisoned goblet substituted at the last moment, or a toxin applied to the rim of a cup after it had been tasted. Some poisons might have been designed to be activated by another substance consumed later, or their effects masked by strong spices or wine. The cat-and-mouse game between poisoner and protector was a constant, deadly struggle of wits and resources. One quirky, lesser-known aspect of successful poisonings might involve the use of contact poisons, or toxins absorbed through the skin, though the efficacy and historical prevalence of such methods are often more in the realm of legend than proven fact for most periods. However, the fear of such an invisible threat, a poisoned glove, a tainted robe, would have added another layer to the paranoia of rulers. Could a food taster even protect against such a method? Unlikely. The consequences of a successful royal poisoning were often profound. It could trigger a succession crisis, leading to civil war or dynastic collapse. It could eliminate a key political player, shifting the balance of power. It would certainly lead to a wave of arrests, interrogations, tortures, and executions, as the surviving regime sought to find and punish the perpetrators, and often to eliminate any other potential threats. The atmosphere in a court after a successful poisoning would be thick with terror, suspicion, and grief. It is a sobering thought that despite the elaborate rituals, the trusted servants, the magical amulets, and the constant vigilance, the assassins, vile, sometimes proved more potent. These instances where feasts turned fatal serve as a stark reminder of the limits of ancient and medieval security measures, the cunning of those who sought to use poison for their own ends, and the ultimate vulnerability of even the most powerful individuals. The food taster stood as a human shield, but sometimes that shield was tragically and fatally breached, plunging a kingdom into chaos or quietly altering the course of history, one poisoned morsel at a time. The chilling accounts of feasts turned fatal, where even the diligent food taster couldn't prevent a monarch's poisoned demise, now lead your sleepy thoughts into the bustling, hot, and often highly stressful environment of the royal kitchens. While the taster faced the immediate peril of the poisoned dish, the cooks, scullions, and other kitchen staff lived under a different, but equally intense, form of pressure. A single mistake, an accidental contamination, a poorly prepared dish that caused the ruler even mild indigestion, let alone serious illness, could lead to devastating accusations of incompetence, negligence, or, in the worst-case scenario, deliberate treason. This was Kitchen Confidential, ancient style, where a dropped pinch of the wrong herb could have lethal consequences, not just for the diner, but for the entire kitchen brigade. Imagine the scene. A vast, cavernous medieval or Renaissance kitchen, a hive of frantic activity. The taster was a living memento mori, a constant reminder of the ruler's vulnerability and the treachery that lurked within the court. The precise social standing and integration of food tasters within the court hierarchy is a complex question, likely varying greatly by period and culture, and is a subject historians infer from often indirect evidence. One quirky, lesser-known peril might simply be the occupational hazard of developing a very jaded or overly suspicious palate. After years of tasting for poison, could one ever truly enjoy food again? Would every slightly unusual flavor, every unfamiliar spice, trigger a wave of anxiety? The job might save the ruler's life, but it could destroy the taster's own relationship with one of life's fundamental pleasures. So, when you tally up the taster's table scraps, the balance sheet looks decidedly grim. A few mouthfuls of slightly better food, a precarious proximity to power, perhaps a slightly less grueling existence than some other forms of servitude. These were weighed against the daily dance with death, the constant fear, the psychological torment, and the high probability of a painful and unlamented end. It was a gilded cage indeed, but one where the gilding was thin, and the bars were forged from the ever-present threat of the poisoned chalice. The perks, such as they were, seem a very small compensation for a life lived perpetually on the knife edge of disaster. The image of that perpetually anxious royal food taster, carefully weighing the meager perks of their position against its overwhelming perils, begins to shift as the centuries unroll. The gilded cage, with its constant threat of a poisoned chalice, doesn't disappear overnight, but its bars slowly, almost imperceptibly, begin to corrode. You'd now observe how the role of the dedicated official food taster, that human shield, against assassination by supper, gradually diminished in many royal courts. Its decline influenced by a complex interplay of changing political landscapes, evolving social customs, improvements in food safety, however rudimentary at first, and eventually the dawn of a more scientific understanding of toxicology and medicine. The fading flavors of fear, though slow to dissipate entirely, signaled a move towards a world where rulers felt perhaps just a little less likely to be dispatched by a deadly dish. The decline was not a uniform or linear process. In some courts, particularly those prone to intense political instability or dynastic turmoil, the food taster remained a fixture for much longer than in others. But several broad trends contributed to the gradual obsolescence of this grim profession. Firstly, changes in political structures and the nature of power played a role. The rise of more stable, centralized nation-states in Europe during the early modern period, with more established lines of succession and more sophisticated mechanisms of governance and control, perhaps slowly reduced, though certainly didn't, eliminate the kind of intense, personal, and often familial rivalries that so frequently led to poisoning plots in earlier, more fragmented feudal societies or volatile Renaissance city-states. While assassination remained a political tool, the methods and opportunities might have shifted. This move towards more bureaucratized and less personally volatile forms of governance in many parts of Europe is a broad mainstream historical trend. Secondly, advancements in medical knowledge and the nascent understanding of science, however slow, began to chip away at the effectiveness and necessity of relying solely on a human taster. While a true understanding of toxicology was still centuries away, the ability to identify certain common poisons, or at least to recognize their symptoms more accurately, gradually improved. The magical poison detectors like unicorn horns and bezoar stones, while retaining their allure for a surprisingly long time, slowly began to lose credibility among the more educated. As medical understanding grew, the focus shifted slightly from just detecting poison after ingestion to trying to prevent its administration in the first place, or to having more, allegedly, effective antidotes on hand if poisoning was suspected. Improvements in food preparation, hygiene, and general public health, though again, a very slow and uneven process, also played a part. While medieval and Renaissance kitchens were hardly bastions of sanitation by modern standards, a growing awareness of the dangers of spoiled or contaminated food, distinct from deliberate poisoning, might have led to slightly better practices. Over time, reducing the number of instances where a ruler fell ill from natural foodborne causes, which in turn might have slightly lessened the immediate suspicion of deliberate poisoning in every case of royal indigestion. The increasing complexity and formality of royal courts also led to more elaborate security measures surrounding the preparation and serving of food. As you've seen, the journey from kitchen to royal table could involve multiple layers of supervision, sealed containers, and trusted officials, making it more difficult, though never impossible, for a poisoner to act undetected. The food taster became just one link in a longer, more intricate chain of security, rather than the sole, desperate defense. One quirky, lesser-known factor that might have contributed to the decline in the visibility of official tasters, even if some precautionary tasting continued, could be changing social customs and a desire by monarchs to appear less overtly fearful or reliant on such grim safeguards. As notions of royal majesty and accessibility evolved, the public ritual of food tasting might have seemed somewhat crude or overly paranoid, perhaps better conducted discreetly behind the scenes, or replaced by a general sense that the entire household staff was, in effect, vouching for the safety of the royal meal through their diligence. The precise moment when formal public food tasting ceased to be a standard practice in various European courts is difficult to pinpoint and is a subject that would require detailed study of specific court protocols over time. It's also important to note that even as the dedicated role of the official food taster waned in some Western courts, the fear of poisoning certainly didn't vanish. Political leaders, even into the 20th and 21st centuries, have continued to take precautions regarding their food security, though these now involve sophisticated screening methods, trusted personal chefs, and secure supply chains, rather than a human praegustator. The methods change, but the underlying anxiety of those in power about hidden threats remains a timeless theme. So, as you watch the centuries turn, you see the figure of the royal food taster gradually receding into the historical shadows in many parts of the world. The once essential human shield, the living litmus test, becomes less and less a standard fixture of the royal household. The flavors of fear that once permeated every royal banquet begin, ever so slowly, to fade, replaced by a slightly more, though perhaps never entirely, confident approach to dining. The decline of this peculiar profession is a quiet testament to a world slowly, and often painfully, moving towards greater stability, improved knowledge, and perhaps just a little less paranoia on the menu. The image of that slowly receding figure, the royal food taster, their perilous profession gradually fading into the annals of history, now brings our sleepy exploration to its gentle conclusion. You've journeyed through centuries of suspicion, from the ancient courts of pharaohs and emperors to the drafty castles of medieval lords and the glittering palaces of Renaissance princes, all haunted by the ever-present fear of a poisoned morsel. As we drift off, we find ourselves reflecting on this peculiar and often terrifying occupation, a stark testament to the paranoia that so often accompanies power, the extraordinary lengths taken to protect those at the top, and perhaps a quiet appreciation for a world where such a grim duty is, for most of us, thankfully just a historical curiosity. You've imagined the gilded cage of the royal court, where the opulence of the banquet table was always overshadowed by the gnawing fear in the taster's stomach. You've traced the ancient origins of the praegustator in Rome and their counterparts in Egypt, individuals walking a tightrope between proximity to power and a very personal proximity to pain. You've shivered in medieval castles, where every meal was a morsel of mistrust, and the taster was a key, if perpetually stressed, guardian. You've witnessed the solemn ritual and immense responsibility of the tasting process, far more than just a quick nibble. You've peered into the shadowy pharmacopoeia of perils they faced, the arsenic, the hemlock, the cleverly disguised toxins. You've pondered the guinea pig paradox, the complex dance of trust and treachery between the taster and their master, and the often dubious, superstitious tools they relied upon. You've felt the chill of panic that would erupt if the taster did succumb, their agony a grim warning, and the ensuing ruthless investigation. Our journey also took us beyond the main course to the loyal cupbearer facing their own liquid ordeal. We peeked into the alchemist's lab, with its promises of often ineffective universal antidotes. We saw that this fear and the need for tasters extended beyond the throne to lesser nobles and notables. We recalled those infamous feasts that turned fatal, a chilling reminder that sometimes, despite all precautions, the poisoner succeeded. We felt the immense pressure on the royal kitchen staff, where an accidental slip could mean accusations of treason. Huge fireplaces roar with roasting spits turning whole animals, oxen, deer, swans. Cauldrons bubble with mysterious pottages and stews. Bakers slide loaves of bread into hot ovens. Scullions rush about with heavy pots and armfuls of produce. The air is thick with smoke, steam, the sizzle of fat, the aroma of spices, and the shouts of the head cook trying to orchestrate this culinary chaos. This wasn't a calm, well-ordered modern professional kitchen. It was often a hot, dirty, and incredibly high-pressure environment. The head cook, or chef de cuisine in later, more formalized courts, bore the ultimate responsibility for everything that emerged from his domain. He, and it was almost invariably a he in these high-status positions, had to ensure not only that the food was palatable and prepared according to the often exacting tastes of the ruler, but also that it was safe. He would oversee the sourcing of ingredients, checking for freshness and quality. He would supervise his army of undercooks, scullions, and kitchen boys, ensuring they followed proper, for the time, hygiene and preparation methods. This concern with the quality and safety of ingredients, especially for the royal table, is a mainstream historical fact, as spoiled food could be just as dangerous as deliberate poison. The pressure to avoid accidental contamination was immense. In an era with no refrigeration as we know it, limited understanding of bacteriology, and often questionable water sources, food could spoil quickly. A piece of tainted meat, a poorly washed vegetable, or milk that had turned could cause severe gastrointestinal distress. If the king fell ill after a meal, even if it was just a simple case of food poisoning, the first place suspicion would be the kitchen's. The head cook would be interrogated. Was it carelessness, incompetence, or something more sinister? And then there was the ever-present threat of deliberate poisoning by someone within the kitchen staff. A disgruntled scullion, a bribed undercook, a spy placed by a rival faction. The opportunities for introducing a toxic substance into a dish during its preparation were numerous, despite any security measures. The head cook had to be constantly vigilant, watching his staff, perhaps restricting access to certain ingredients or certain stages of the preparation to only the most trusted individuals. He might even have his own informal tasters within the kitchen, sampling ingredients or sauces at various points. The consequences for a royal cook accused of poisoning the king, whether intentionally or through gross negligence, would be horrific. Treason, especially regicide or attempted regicide, was the most heinous of crimes, invariably punished by a slow, agonizing, and very public execution, perhaps being boiled alive, a punishment specifically recorded for poisoners in some periods, like under Henry VIII in England, or hanged, drawn, and quartered. Even if the cook was entirely innocent, but a poisoning occurred on his watch, he might still face torture to extract information about potential conspirators, and his career, if not his life, would be over. One quirky, lesser-known aspect of royal kitchen pressure might involve the highly specific and sometimes bizarre dietary requirements or preferences of certain rulers. Some monarchs had notoriously picky appetites or subscribed to specific dietary theories based on humoral medicine or religious beliefs. The cook would have to cater to these whims, ensuring each dish was prepared exactly to the royal specification, lest he incur displeasure, which, even if it didn't lead to accusations of poisoning, could still result in a loss of favor or position. Imagine trying to prepare a meal for a king who would only eat swan prepared in a very particular way, or who believed that certain combinations of foods were inherently unhealthy or unlucky. The culinary tightrope would be immense. The sheer scale of some royal kitchens and the number of staff involved also added to the complexity and pressure, feeding not just the royal family, but often the entire court. Hundreds, sometimes thousands, of people at major feasts required incredible organization and logistical skill. A breakdown in this system, a failure to produce the required number of dishes on time and to an acceptable standard, could also be a source of severe trouble for the kitchen staff. The historical logistics of provisioning and running these massive, royal kitchens, often with limited technology, is a fascinating area of study. So, as you peer into that smoky, chaotic, high-pressure environment of the royal kitchen, you see that the stress wasn't confined to the food taster at the high table. Every member of the kitchen staff, from the lowliest pot scrubber to the esteemed head cook, lived under a cloud of intense scrutiny and potential peril. A simple mistake, a moment of carelessness, or the malicious act of another could bring down devastating consequences. The phrase, "too many cooks spoil the broth," might have had a far more literal and terrifying meaning in a royal kitchen, where a spoiled broth could indeed lead to a spoiling of careers and lives. The steamy, high-pressure atmosphere of the royal kitchen, with its stressed-out chefs and the ever-present fear of a culinary catastrophe, now leads you to consider the life of the royal food taster from a slightly different angle. Beyond the daily, nerve-wracking dance with potential death, were there any upsides to this perilous profession? What were the potential perks, however meager, that might have made someone tolerate or even aspire to such a high-risk position? And how did these perceived benefits weigh against the constant, life-threatening dangers? As you delve into the taster's table scraps, both literal and metaphorical, you begin to appreciate the complex, often grim, cost-benefit analysis that defined this unique role. One of the most obvious, though perhaps double-edged perks, was access to the royal kitchens, and by extension, to food that was generally of a much higher quality than that available to the average person. While the taster's primary concern was detecting poison, not savouring haute cuisine, they were nonetheless consuming dishes prepared for a monarch. This meant access to fresher ingredients, more expensive spices, more elaborate preparations, and a greater variety of foodstuffs than most commoners could ever dream of. In an era where famine or food scarcity could be a real threat for much of the population, simply having regular, guaranteed access to food, even if it came with a side, order of mortal peril, might have seemed like a significant benefit to someone from an impoverished background. This access to better quality food, even if only in small tasting portions, is a plausible, if rarely explicitly stated, perk of the job. Proximity to power was another undeniable, if equally risky aspect of the position. The food taster, like the cupbearer, was often part of the monarch's intimate household. They were present at private meals and important banquets. They witnessed courtly life firsthand. This could, in some instances, lead to a degree of familiarity with the ruler and other powerful figures. A clever, discreet, and long-serving taster might gain the monarch's trust beyond just the trust me not to die aspect, and perhaps even a measure of influence, however informal. They might overhear important conversations, gain insights into court politics, and potentially use this knowledge to their advantage or to help their family or allies. For an enslaved individual or someone of very low social standing, the role of food taster, despite its dangers, could represent a step up in the household hierarchy. It was a position of responsibility, requiring a certain level of trust. This might come with slightly better living conditions, better clothing, or perhaps even small monetary rewards or gifts from a grateful and still living monarch. Compared to the brutal, anonymous toil of a field hand or a mine worker, the life of a royal food taster, however fraught with anxiety, might have seemed preferable to some. However, these potential perks must be weighed against the overwhelming and constant perils. The primary peril, of course, was the very real possibility of being poisoned and suffering an agonizing death. This wasn't a theoretical risk, it was the core function of the job. Every single meal was a gamble, even if the taster survived. For many years, the cumulative stress of this daily Russian roulette, the constant fear, the heightened vigilance, must have taken a tremendous psychological toll. Imagine the nightmares, the anxiety, the inability to ever truly relax or enjoy a meal. Then there was the peril of false accusation. If the ruler fell ill from any cause, even a common ailment or simple indigestion, the food taster, along with the cooks would be among the first to fall under suspicion. In a paranoid court environment, an innocent taster could easily be scapegoated, accused of negligence or complicity in a non-existent poisoning plot, and subjected to torture or execution. Their survival depended not just on their ability to detect poison, but also on the ruler's health remaining robust from all other causes. Another peril was the sheer isolation of the role. While close to power, the taster was also set apart. Other courtiers might view them with a mixture of pity, suspicion, and perhaps a touch of morbid fascination. Friendships might be difficult to form, as who would want to get too close to someone whose job was literally to die first? And we weighed the meager table scraps of perks against the overwhelming perils of this life or death position. Finally, we observed the slow fading of this flavor of fear, as political landscapes shifted and scientific understanding, however, gradually began to dawn. What does this doze-inducing deduction on dining dangerously leave us with? It's a profound reminder of the vulnerability of power and the often brutal measures deemed necessary for its preservation. The food taster stands as a symbol of a world where life was often precarious, where trust was a rare commodity, and where the fear of a sudden, agonizing death by treachery was a constant companion for those who wore the crown or held the scepter. This reliance on human subjects to test for safety before a powerful individual partook is a stark illustration of pre-scientific power dynamics and anxieties, a recurring motif in historical studies of leadership and court life. It also highlights the extraordinary resilience, or perhaps the desperate fatalism, of those individuals who undertook such a role. Whether driven by loyalty, coercion, or the slimmest hope of a better life, they faced their daily duty with the knowledge that any meal could be their last. Their story is a quiet, often overlooked footnote in the grand narratives of kings and queens, but it's a story of courage, however unsung, and of survival, however tenuous. One final quirky thought to drift away on. Imagine the sheer relief, the unadulterated joy that a retired food taster, if such a fortunate individual ever existed, must have felt when finally able to eat a simple meal without that cold knot of fear in their stomach, without their senses on high alert for the bitter tang of death. That first, truly carefree bite would have been a liberation indeed. The evolution of trust in food preparation, from personal tasters to modern regulatory agencies, is a long and complex journey, the endpoint of which we often take for granted, as the last echoes of these ancient and medieval banquets fade, as the image of the anxious taster dissolves into the soft darkness. Perhaps you can savor the simple piece of your own next meal, taken without the need for a human shield. The world of state-sanctioned poison paranoia, thankfully, belongs to the history books, a chilling but ultimately fascinating chapter in humanity's long, strange, and often dangerous relationship with power, trust, and the simple act of eating. The grand banquet halls of history, with their glittering tableware and shadowy intrigues, now begin to dim. The anxious face of the royal food taster, forever scrutinizing each morsel for the hint of death, fades into the gentle quiet of your own peaceful space. The stories of poisoned chalices, dubious antidotes, and the immense pressure of dining dangerously have served their purpose for tonight, lulling you towards a far safer, more serene state of rest. Allow your mind to drift away from those perilous feasts and the constant, gnawing fear that accompanied them. Let go of the image of the taster's trembling hand, the ruler's suspicious gaze. Instead, feel the simple, undeniable comfort of your own surroundings, the gentle weight of your blanket, the steady, quiet rhythm of your own breathing, the intricate dance of trust and treachery that defined those ancient courts can recede into the mists of time. Here, in this tranquil haven, there is only the assurance of safety, the gentle invitation to let go. This journey through one of history's most nerve-wracking professions perhaps leaves you with a quiet appreciation for the mundane miracle of a meal taken in peace, without the need for a human shield. The anxieties that once dictated the very act of eating for those in power have, for most of us, become the stuff of distant, almost unbelievable tales. And as you rest, you can do so with a sense of gratitude for the layers of trust and safety that underpin our modern world, however imperfect they may be. Imagine those ancient tasters, if they could have ever truly known a moment of unguarded, unanxious repose. Let their deep, unspoken yearning for such peace become a soft, lulling presence. A reminder that the solace of rest, free from fear, is a universal human desire. Let the opulence and the peril of their world dissolve into the warm, comforting darkness behind your eyelids. Your breathing deepens, slows, and settles into an even cadence. Your muscles soften, releasing any lingering tension. Any thoughts of ancient poisons or precarious positions feel as distant and insubstantial as a half-forgotten dream. The only feast before you now is the rich, restorative banquet of sleep, and its only taster, your own peaceful, drifting consciousness. Rest now. Let the gentle tide of tiredness carry you into a calm and untroubled slumber. Sweet dreams. End of script. Sweet dreams.